Okay, today we're going to discuss a very bizarre object somewhere in the Milky Way galaxy. This is the object you see right here, referred to as Dracula's Chivito. And it's called that because, remarkably, it looks like one of those things we find right here on our own planet. It basically looks like some kind of a hamburger. And so just like some of the other objects we usually name after things on Earth, such as the famous Horsehead Nebula, the one that we've discussed previously, and the one you see right here, and the Pillars of Creation, the structure that was analyzed and captured by the James Webb relatively recently, here we once again have something super exciting. And exciting because this is just such a bizarre object for many different reasons. But it's also not the only such object known to us, and actually not the only object that's named after a sandwich. And so in this video we're going to discuss this thing once again, because there is a new study that analyzed it even more and discovered even more bizarre things about it. But I guess first let's briefly look at some of the images we have, starting with some of the earlier pictures from the Hubble telescope. And so here's roughly what it first looked like, based on some of the optical observations. And so, quite bizarre and quite unusual. But almost right away researchers realized what we're actually looking at. And especially because of various infrared emissions coming from inside. This was basically a baby star. And so this object, officially known as IRAS 23077 plus 6707, is basically a protoplanetary disk. A swirling ring of dust and gas where new planets are currently being born, that we've seen many times before. But this one is really special. It's now officially confirmed to be the largest such disk ever discovered. This is an enormous disk that also turns out to be super unusual for a lot of different reasons. It's approximately 600 billion kilometers across, or approximately 40 times larger than the solar system, assuming you include the Kuiper belt, or about 4,000 astronomical units across. But here it's not just the size that's bothering scientists, it's really also what's happening inside. This object seems to be extremely chaotic. Unlike a typical neat circular disk that you see right here, or that we've seen before from other telescopes, this sandwich is lopsided, turbulent, and has a very strange wispy protrusion that researchers now refer to as fangs, which is basically one of the main reasons it's referred to as the Dracula's Chivito. And Chivito is a type of a sandwich, apparently popular in Uruguay, where one of the researchers, Ana Masquera, is from. And so in this video we're going to focus on some of the recent discoveries and some of the new data, and discuss what it tells us about these extreme environments where many different planets are probably forming right now. And as always, you can find all of this in the main study in the description below. But as you might have already guessed, this is essentially a planetary disk that we're looking at from the side. So here you can imagine a kind of a flat spinning plate, but we're observing it not from the top. Instead, we're seeing it from approximately 82 degrees away from us. And well, normally you would assume that you would be looking at a thin line, but in the case of this particular object, because of this angle and because of the very thick dust in the middle that essentially blocks most of the optical light, instead we're seeing this very strange structure. And a structure that contains a very dark lane going right through the middle, which is what makes it kind of resemble a sandwich or a hamburger. That's of course the meat or the filling of the sandwich. But what exactly are the buns in this case? Well, interestingly, the buns are just light reflected from the dust particles above and below the disk. So this is the light coming from the star in the center. And so here the disk itself just acts as a kind of a shield, allowing us to see the faint structure of the surrounding dust without being blinded by the star's direct light, and only seeing the light as a kind of a reflection from both sides of the disk. But the reason why it has this very bizarre name is because of the main authors. One of the authors is from Transylvania, and the other author, as I mentioned, is from Uruguay. And so because of these very strange fangs that this object contains, they eventually decided to give it this strange name. And technically this object is actually visible to most of the modern telescopes, the powerful telescopes, because it's only about 1,000 light years away from us in the constellation of Cepheus. And also because it's really massive compared to everything else, and to date is still the largest such object discovered. But for planetary scientists and for astronomers studying the evolution of stars, this is a really exciting discovery because it essentially kind of defies a lot of different models. And that's because for a very long time we always thought that planetary formation was a relatively clean process. It involved some kind of a smooth disk where things slowly clump together and start forming stars. Once again, this is what you're seeing in the simulation. Yet Dracula's Chivito is definitively showing us that things are way more chaotic and way more turbulent. And so when scientists looked at this object with the Hubble Space Telescope, they officially confirmed several strange features. First, we have these fangs. These are extended filaments of material stretching for approximately 10 arcseconds away from the northern edge of the disk, and seem to be only present on that northern side. The southern side has a sharp edge with no filaments, and right now it's not clear why it has these fangs, or what even produces them. Then we have these wispy layers. Unlike other disks that appear solid, this one has these very bizarre wisps that also extend well above the main disk. And here scientists believe that this could be caused by a material still falling into the disk from the surrounding space. Alternatively, this can also be some kind of a gravitational instability, where the disk is so heavy that it starts to collapse under its own weight. Then, by looking at the spectrum of light coming from this object, scientists identified the central star as what's known as the Herbig AE star, which means that it's a very young, very hot object, much more massive than the Sun, with a total mass of about 1.5 to maybe 2 solar masses, with other researchers even suspecting that maybe this is not a single object, but a binary star, which might explain why there's so much turbulence. But even more importantly, this object is a huge, massive reservoir of gas and dust, containing enough material to create at least 30 Jupiters. So this is an enormous amount of material in a single star system, which in theory, in the next few millions of years, will produce at least a few planets. And so this is definitely going to become an exciting planetary system when it's finished evolving. But the thing is, we have no idea what kind of a system, because researchers were also stunned by its unusual asymmetry. Basically, this object is a bit lopsided, which means that some of these planets might have very bizarre orbits, or there might be a lot of collisions in the future. And that of course suggests that the system seems to be influenced by something, possibly the environment, or possibly something inside. For example, it could be the result of powerful stellar winds. But here, to confirm that this is a baby star and not just some kind of a bizarre nebula or a dying star, scientists also looked at this object using submillimeter array, something referred to as SMA. And this was used to discover additional gas. And well, here they officially detected carbon monoxide, with the gas clearly orbiting the center. This was basically seen as a tiny blue shift and red shift on both sides, which can only be explained if there is a disk and gas orbiting inside the disk. And specifically, material closer to the star moves much faster, which can be definitively seen in a lot of this data. And so this was a smoking gun confirming that we're looking at a rotating planet-forming disk. This cannot be anything else. But strangely enough, here the disk seems to be a little bit eccentric. Instead of being a perfect circle, the data suggests we might have some kind of an oval shape with the eccentricity of 0.26. And that means that there might be already something really heavy inside the disk, possibly a very large hidden planet, or a tiny small star orbiting the main giant. Nevertheless, because this disk is so active and because there's so much gas and dust, it's still actually kind of difficult to analyze all of this, and it's right now still practically impossible to see the center. So basically seeing the planet or seeing the star is still impossible. It would only be visible from the top and not from the side. Nevertheless, the disk still seems to be very dynamic and very young, but also seems to be actively fed by material falling from both sides of the disk, which is why it looks so bizarre but also so beautiful. But if you watch some of the previous videos on the channel, you might also know that this is not the only such object we've discovered, and at least one other object is already known to us that has now also received an unusual, delicious name. Here we have the Gomez's Hamburger, the second sandwich in the night skies that was officially discovered in 1985, but only became very well known in the last couple of years. And here this edge-on disk was originally mistaken for some kind of a dying star, before scientists realized that this was also a baby star and a planetary nursery. Both objects are actually at a relatively similar distance of 900 to 1000 light years away from us, and both of them are relatively isolated. Basically, they don't seem to have a lot of other stars around them. But then we have a bunch of other similar objects that do not have delicious names yet, but are practically the same phenomena. Planetary disks with a somewhat sideways appearance. But when we compare all of them, this one is still the most unique and the largest of them all. It basically seems to involve a much more massive central star and a much bigger planetary disk. Okay, but why exactly is this important and why does this matter? Well, as I mentioned, to some extent this actually kind of breaks previous models, mostly because in most textbooks, what we know about planetary formation seems to come from much smaller and much calmer disks, usually around stars very similar to our Sun. But here Dracula's Chivito gives us a direct look at the extreme end of the spectrum and shows us how planets might form around more massive stars inside environments that are very chaotic and contain a lot of instability. And so if our own solar system started the same way, it would very likely result in a much more violent past and a much messier planetary system involving very bizarre planets and very strange objects orbiting the center. But despite these new observations from the Hubble telescope, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. For example, even right now, we still don't really have precise distance measurements, mostly because this disk is just a little bit too big and a little bit too bright, and so it technically confuses a lot of other telescopes, even the famous Gaia. So right now, trying to measure stellar distances for this type of an object is still challenging. Likewise, we also have not seen any jets. These are usually high-speed beams of matter we often find around these very young stars that are usually expected from these types of Hubble stars and have been seen in the past. And that of course suggests that this system might be slightly more evolved or possibly just somewhat different from anything we've seen before. And so the next step is of course observations with the James Webb. By trying to observe this object in the mid-infrared, researchers will be able to see additional details, especially details of slightly larger particles, which may allow them to determine exactly how much dust there is and how it's orbiting the center, with additional future radio observations, possibly even allowing us to detect planets, or at least protoplanetary objects that might have already settled inside this dark lane. And so here we have a very important reminder that the universe is just weird. The more we look around, the more we realize that a lot of our standard models don't really always explain everything. And so even planetary formation that we always thought was actually understood pretty well seems to have a few examples where things don't make sense. And it's really this giant chaotic object that's very likely going to redefine our understanding and teach us so much more about evolution of stars. Which means that we'll definitely come back and discuss these sandwich hamburger objects in some of the future videos. But until then, check out previous discoveries and previous videos in the description below. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.